Hi, I'm Gary, one of the co-founders here at Awake and chief scientist. I guess by way of introduction, prior to Awake, I was one of the first two employees at Silence. Depending on how you look at it, there was two of us there that first day in Stu's unfinished kitchen. Prior to Silence was at NetWitness. I came into NetWitness via acquisition from another company that I had helped start. That was focused on, I guess, what we nowadays call EDR, although in 2006, you were either in antivirus category or forensics. There's nothing much in between. And if we go far enough back, I got my start doing research and development, working on the Dragon IDS for anyone here who happens to remember that blast from the past. But anyways, we're gonna jump right in here. We got a lot to cover in a relatively short amount of time. So just at a very high level, we're gonna talk about the report that we published almost a week ago now. Very sort of high level findings from the report. Identified about 15,000 domains that were tied directly to C2 or malcode download or exploitative landing pages in a variety of ways. I'll kind of show you some of those things. There were also covered in that report a total of 111 Chrome extensions. Some of those extensions could do things that certainly caught a lot of investigators off guard that we were working with in investigating these cases. Had the capability to do things like take screenshots and read the clipboard and do some other scary things. We'll also take a look at that. About 60% of the extensions we found in total were in the Chrome Web Store. Those were more focused on collecting information and sending information out. The others that had the ability to especially take screenshots actually bypass the Chrome store, and the report gets into details and information on that. Actually look at a little bit of an example of that here. But in all cases, both the really kind of scary examples, if you will, and the ones that were what we could call more intricate, the ones in the web store, just a mass surveillance. The reach of this campaign was really surprising to see. I'll kind of reference that as we go through this too. Also, what came out of this investigation was insight into an incredibly effective way of subverting analysis by the security industry. And what we saw was across almost all of these 15,000 domains, incorrect assessments of them across the industry. So you'll see some examples of that, how most all of them have been misclassified by classification engines. And so therefore, firewalls that rely on those classifications happily let most of this traffic through. Sandboxes kind of incorrectly labeling the activity associated with these things and associated examples. The report is quite long, quite detailed. So what we're going to cover in this talk is a bit of a summary across all the major data points, but there's a lot more detail in the paper. And of course, if you have questions that are unanswered after both of those, we're happy to continue working with people to answer those questions. So here's a basic timeline of, we're gonna go through kind of a basic timeline of how this investigation unfolded and kind of some of the major findings that came out of each of the major milestones here. And so this really started actually, I realized this morning, almost exactly a year ago to the day. June 2019, we actually started developing some presentations to deliver to our customers. As a sidebar at Awake, our business model is a little different. We don't just sell technology and walk away. We have very tight partnerships with all of our customers and help in investigations and write reports and do things like that. And so as we were doing this work together with our customers or other partners, we started identifying a really large uptick in rogue extensions, browser extensions that were ultimately exfiltrating data out, sending data out. And we saw that, at the time, a lot of this activity, most of the activity fell into one of two buckets. And so the first bucket was what we were calling at the time the info to extreme activity. And so a few months ago, Duo Security released a really good report on what ended up being all of that activity. It's actually a fantastic report, so check it out if you're not familiar with it. But what all of those extensions had in common, besides the way they were going about harvesting information and sending it out, was their C2 servers were all hosted in a single ASN called info to extreme. So that's why we started calling them that. The other category, every domain, there was a lot of domains and just an increasing list of domains that were associated with them. But the thing that tied them all together was they were all registered by Galcom or through Galcom. And so, that provoked us to ask this question, well, who is Galcom? And so we turned that around and we said, okay, well, what legitimate activity do we see out there going to Galcom domains? And when we looked across the board, across different continents, different segments of the market, different industries, what we found was unless the enterprise had business travelers going to Israel, we saw zero legitimate traffic from the vast majority of the enterprises we worked with. Saw zero legitimate traffic associated with Galcom. But what we did find, on the other hand, that was quite concerning was we found persistent footholds from these types of extensions going to Galcom domains in the vast majority of places we looked. Not only back then, but through even to today. And so great, we noticed that. But when we go investigate and start working on reports and notifications for customers, as I mentioned, we're very involved in, we found that a lot of these domains, unless they were clearly the C2 domains, a lot of them just showed up as parked pages, right? And so we'd see this traffic on the network look very, very, very suspicious, or clearly sending data out that shouldn't be sent out. But then when we go start investigating the domains associated, we just see these parked pages. Or when we go and start querying the reputation databases that are out there and sandboxes, everything's coming back and constantly telling us that, hey, this is low risk, no risk, no problem here. Like we see here, this domain is example sites. It's like Google or Schwab or Amazon. And so, when you're looking in, critical infrastructure like a power plant or a chemical manufacturer or something like that, and you find this traffic that's very unique to that environment, and it's unknown elsewhere, you think, this might be something targeted. But when you find activity that is so prevalent, across so many different environments, and you go cross-reference and you see results like this, you start thinking, wow, what are we doing wrong here? This is not adding up, doesn't quite make sense. And so that continued for a little while until February. And so what happened in February was, this was before shelter in place, so it feels like a year and a half ago now. But in February, I was flying back from the East Coast. And a lot of times I'll travel with multiple laptops. One is the regular laptop and the other I use for malware testing or analysis and things like that. So a lot of my analysis I do not in sandboxes or virtual machines or in the cloud, but on bare metal, and have a special configuration for that. So I was on this plane and I was doing some testing related to this activity. Now, on an airplane, as most of you know, the bandwidth is incredibly limited. And so my test system is normally configured to bounce its connection through proxies so that I never have to worry about coming from an attributable address of any kind. Well, on an airplane, your bandwidth is so restricted that I didn't want to deal with that latency of additional proxies. So I turned that off and just directly connected, at least to the airplane, thinking, hey, airplane IP address, that's pretty non-attributable anyways. Well, great, do that. And the results were surprising. So I hit some domains, as part of this testing routine I was going through, hit some domains that I knew for certain were parked, at least every time I had interacted with them before. But now all of a sudden, with this direct connection, I was getting completely different results than I had seen before. And so, I started going back through this list of domains that we're organizing. And as I went through and started sampling domains, I realized, coming through at least this airplane connection, across all of them, I was getting totally different results. I was getting redirected to exploitative kind of landing pages like this, or others that try to prompt you into installing browser extensions and things like that. And so I thought, wow, this is really strange. How do we further validate this? So after getting back, I started going to coffee shops or office buildings with open networks and things like that, and started testing to see, wait, do I see the same behavior that I saw on the airplane? And sure enough, what I found was when connecting through a subscriber line connection, so the type of connections that people have at home or offices have, like we see here, DSL type connections. When you connect through those types of connections that most companies have, we get the redirect to the exploitative landing page. Now, this had never happened before. Like 9 months prior to this, we had not seen this. And what we realized was what we were doing up to that point was what I think most security analysts do, right? If you have a domain or something you're investigating, you turn to cloud-based services. So we run it in sandboxes, we run it through reputation checkers, we run it through URL scanners and things like that. Well, what do all of these services have in common? Right? I mean, from reputation checkers that we see here on the left, looking at this domain, kongua.info, to running it through VirusTotal, which checks it with 75 different products, and actually VirusTotal also references a number of additional reputation checkers, and all these other services. What do these all have in common? Well, they all pretty much are coming from transit networks or data centers, or the cloud, if you will. And what we found as we started doing testing across the entire data set was when you connect through these cloud type connections, always we would get directed to basically totally benign parking pages. Mostly it was these benign parking pages, but some type of benign landing page. So here we see our example for youngkongua.info. Now, what happens if we take these exact same domains and just literally a few seconds later connect from a subscriber line, even using the exact same computer we just used for the previous test? Well, here we see, before you continue to youngkongua.info, you need to, you should go install this browser extension. So a lot of times we get these, browser kind of, prompts, or these extension prompts. There's also just a whole range of different types of exploitative landing pages. Here we see an example of what looks to be kind of like a one of these support fraud type examples, but also highlighted there in the upper left, trying to nicely download several files and help us run them. So anyway, it's just a whole range of pages there that we were seeing redirection from around a lot of these domains. Okay, so as we get into the Galcon cases, what we see is a lot of them revolved around redirecting users to these more exploitative type pages. A lot of them kind of revolved around these extensions that were in the Chrome store. But there was also a second category of extensions. And these are the ones that I think were really attention getting as we started coming across them. And just kind of an FYI aside, it was really since the start of 2020, and I'd probably approximate this around February to March timeframe. What I'm getting ready to talk about here, we've seen a large increase in, which was sort of interesting to note. But what we see here is a different type of extensions that were being pushed to clients. And these types of extensions very frequently came hand in hand with executables. And so what we see here in the network traffic on the left, on the right, is in line number 1 there, we see an executable being downloaded from CloudFront. Then further down, lines 4 and 5, we see .crx. So that's the file extension for extensions. We see those being downloaded from CloudFront as well. Now, keep in mind, extensions should really only be coming from Google, and the Chrome Web Store should not be plain text coming from CloudFront. So very clearly, this is an out-of-store extension. And these extensions are of the type that you see here on the left. So these are the type that are able to read clipboard contents, but really more concerning, like you see highlighted there, desktop capture. There's actually a variety of capture APIs that they make available. And a lot of these go hand in hand. They're very modular. So like we see here, multiple extensions being downloaded. So we see different functions that get implemented in the different extensions. And then they'll also utilize executables to carry out various functions. Actually, in our archives for presentations on our website, you'll see one of our threat researchers gave a presentation recently kind of talking about how extensions have been involved in even doing like Active Directory scanning, things like that. It's quite stunning. So we see that here. Great. All right. Now, this is what's interesting. A very big pattern that we noticed in this activity. And that was the executables that were most frequently associated with this activity was InstallCore. And so the paper, takes a section to kind of focus on InstallCore because it was so prevalent. It was a big part of this 40% of the extensions that were being distributed outside the web store. And so InstallCore is a pretty interesting application. Most of the time you encounter it, it'll have very low detection. Whether the detection is low or high, it's almost always identified as a PUP, a potentially unwanted program, or PUA, right, potentially unwanted application. So it's a very kind of effective, actually, tool, I think, to be used in these borderline type cases, or maybe it's not so borderline, as we'll see in a minute here. But the types of applications that InstallCore was being used to push and then ultimately generate traffic like we see here, it was, in a lot of cases, actually custom rolled versions of Chromium that were configured to happily use these extensions with all the permissions, turned on like a Christmas tree. So any other functionality that they try to run, they can go ahead and run without user intervention or notification. And so yeah, we see that when the report references that. But getting back to InstallCore, here's the interesting thing about it. So this is from an analysis sandbox run of actually specifically the InstallCore binary that I took out of the previous screenshot. And as you can see, it does things like install input devices and things that are used for keystroke logging. It has a variety of sandbox evasion techniques and looking for virtual machines and checking for debuggers and basically all the things that we as analysts think of as malware, not a PUP, malware, right? And so this was another kind of a pattern that started emerging over time as we were doing this and as we were interacting with our customers as we detected this stuff, that we started finding that, I mean, look, so after doing working on threat detection, technologies and methodologies for about 20 years now, it's my opinion that the term PUP, the definition of the term PUP has changed. So it was about 15 years ago that I feel like we really kind of started hearing that and using that term a lot more. And, to me, the definition back then that most people, just kind of implicitly assigned to the term PUP was this type of application that all the examples that we had found of it were benign, but they implemented features that were very similar to what malware does. And so they were very concerning and, people should know about them and they're suspicious and you should probably get rid of them. Even though we didn't have evidence, a lot of evidence of it being used maliciously, we just had, they're popping up coupons and things like that. The way they were going about it was, just not the type of software you want in the enterprise. I think that it seems that definition has changed, that's not the case today. That it seems like the definition today is PUP means this application, this software has been seen used legitimately before, period on the sentence, right? And the problem with that is when you look at a lot of security teams, they don't respond to PUP alerts as that's the definition. A lot of people think of PUP as the old definition that, okay, it might be suspicious, but we've never seen anything bad associated with it, which is very, very much not the case now. I mean, time and time again, we tested this in doing this research. We found quite the opposite. So, so that was something interesting to kind of note and pull out of the report. Also, And we'll kind of get into some other things related to that. So okay, this catches us up to a few months ago. At this point, we had a lot of data that kind of indicated, okay, all the traffic we're seeing associated with Golomb is malicious, clearly malicious or very high risk for enterprises. How far down the rabbit hole does this go? So we turned around and we said, okay, let's get all the domains. So we went through Whois and harvested all the domains that were currently registered and currently reachable that were registered through Golomb. And we went through and we did an analysis of all of them that ultimately ended up in a huge amount of data, like you kind of see summarized here. And we'll actually look at this in slightly more detail towards the end too. But what we did during this process was we went out and we harvested basically every page associated with all these domains. And what we were looking for in doing this analysis was we were looking to see, from how JavaScript was using those pages, how much of it, what it was doing, why they were using it, how the HTML was utilizing various elements throughout the pages. We were getting into server, versions and configurations based on what we could infer from the way, return codes were given to us. Analysis of hosting as well as name server characteristics. As you can see, kind of getting down into cookie analysis and tracking elements that are embedded in the pages, and the redirect chains, which were also very important and very informative. And as we were redirected through this redirect change, we do that same analysis on each step of the redirect. And of course, a very intense analysis on whatever that final kind of landing page was after the redirection. Now, we also had some data we could start with because we had about 9 months of investigative, data prior to this. So we had a list of known C2, definitive known C2 servers, servers or domains that were hosting malcode, those that kind of had these exploitative landing pages. And so, we had some data that we could use almost like in a labeling sense to understand when we took the raw scan data and started clustering it, we had a lot of insight to be able to understand those clusters. So we clustered them, and then after we had the clusters, we went through and kind of manually validated that what we see in those clusters, yes, are indeed more of the same types of domains that were found through this method. So very different kind of approach to having to go about an investigation like this. I think for a lot of us, we're used to doing investigations where you have a few domains, maybe a dozen, or a few binaries, half dozen or so. But starting with a total of 26,000 domains, and then trying to figure out how much of those are bad or not bad, we had to take a very different approach in this case. So kind of some insight there. What we ultimately found from the remaining 15,000 that were associated with badness, vast majority of those, as you see here in the red, are tied directly to either the exploitative landing pages or the C2 type activity. And malcode distribution, and we could reproduce, anything that was in red, we could reproduce. We could show that, yes, this is behaving the same way as the other ones that we've seen before. There's that thin band in orange there that the paper kind of shows an example, like certain servers, especially the C2 examples, were configured to only respond if certain header elements were in there and correct. And so in those cases, if we didn't have pre-existing knowledge of what header elements it was looking for, we couldn't get it to respond, but every other characteristic of it overlapped completely with the other C2 servers we knew about, so we knew that they were definitely associated. And then in those other two categories, the medium and medium low, what's kind of interesting is even in the red domains, what we saw was the vast majority of those used parked domain monetization platforms. So I'll just call them PDM, parked domain monetization. And so, in the cases even where they were filtering requests coming in, they were still making money off those requests, right? So by using these PDM platforms, but then for the requests that came from subscriber lines, right, that could be an end user or a corporate user that got redirected through the malicious chains, they went on a different path. So what we saw in these bottom two categories were the exact same, not just the same park domain monetization platforms, which do have legitimate uses as well. But what we saw in these categories was they had the exact same signatures of their use in the as we saw in the red category. So it separated them from the normal, quote unquote, normal kind of legitimate, I would say, quote unquote, legitimate use of these PDM platforms as well. And the difference between those two categories is whether we saw redirection or not broadly. Okay, so that catches us up now to a couple months ago. At this point, we have a list of thousands of domains here. We have all kinds of details about which ones are used in C2 and how, and the kind of executables associated with them, and then the others, and the extensions that were associated with them, and the type of data that's being sent out by these extensions and how they operate. And so our very next step was to go to Golomb and do what we normally do as investigators, which is contact the registrar and start the process of investigating them together with the registrar to get them taken offline, take them down, black hole them, and do these things, right? So on back in April, which now after shelter in place feels like about a year ago. But back in April 29th was our initial reach out to Golomb, called them. We used the web form on their website to submit a request for contact. And then also, as you see here, emailed abuse at Golomb, security at Golomb, and support at Golomb. And described, hey, we have many domains that we want to talk with you guys about. This is, I think, an attention-getting number of domains. And activity, when asking about what the policy, what the process is for continuing to investigate, and further down, we're asking about who we should work with and how that should work. We got no response, right? Total silence. And so we waited a little while just to give them time. I know ICANN specifies it's supposed to be 24 hours, but I mean, not only does everybody get busy, but this was also when the world was sheltering in place. So we completely understand things could get crazy. And so we waited until about May 8th, or I should say we waited 9 days, and on May 8th, followed up again, same channels, rewrote the message, hey, referencing, the kind of earlier notification. We want to see, what do we do? Where do we go from here? How do we work with you guys to get these addressed and resolved? Again, total silence, no response. So after that, we decided, okay, this is really suspicious. It doesn't support the case that Galomb's an innocent bystander here necessarily, but hey, we need to kind of validate what we're seeing here. So instead, we turned to Google. Google ran their own independent investigation on this and analysis of all the data, and resulted in pretty much all. I think there might be a couple that are still up, but basically all the extensions that were in the report that were in the Chrome store, violating various policies of theirs, and validating the data in the port until getting those pulled off. One note that personally I want to make is, I've seen a lot of the headlines kind of around this report, and Google's caught a lot of flack around this report, which was really surprising, I think, for me to see. We talked about, you kind of referenced that Duo report that came out a few months ago. In parallel with that, Google announced, new policies and new processes to address Chrome Web Store security. And actually, when I look at what happened with this report, I think it was a great example of them delivering on, this kind of commitment to Chrome Web Store security. I mean, this is exactly what happened here. They took the information. They were great to work with. They did their own independent investigation and took action. So I personally was happy with that. Now, yes, I do think that there is an issue here that we need to be sensitive to, like we broadly, which is business has changed, right? Enterprises are not buying licenses for physical software anymore. They're buying licenses for access to cloud-based applications and services, right? Quite broadly. And so what this means is that most of the business that most of the users in our enterprise do, or in enterprises do, have been consolidated into the browser. So that's one, really big, I think, issue to be sensitive to, is that most critical business functions now gets done in the browser. But the second issue there is, what you might think of as a bit of browser monoculture. I mean, the reality is Chrome does represent a massive portion of the market, of the usage of browsers out there, right? So that you put these two things together, and from a defender's perspective, you kind of start to have to ask the question, well, what does it mean if the browser is the weakest link in my security posture for the enterprise? And the answers to that are actually can be a little scary, right? But I think that those are questions reports like this, and Duo's reports and others that we've seen, others that are even referenced in this report, really force us as an industry to, I think, ask ourselves a little more honestly. So there is that. Okay. Now we finished working with Google, and we were basically ready to release the report. And so as we were going through the kind of final versions of the report and vetting it with various people, there was a journalist who became familiar with it and asked to, talk to them, asked if they could do a story, and we agreed to work with them. And as part of that, the journalist said, "Hey, I'm going to reach out to Galcom and see if I can get a response." Great, good luck. And so the journalist sent an initial, made some initial calls and sent an initial email. And for that first one, he actually did get a response. Very generic. Hey, there's, I don't know what you're talking about with this report you're working on. I've never heard of it. We work with law enforcement. There's no problems here. Basically, is what it was saying. And so the journalist came back to us and said, "Hey, what should we do about this?" And we're like, "Great. I mean, that was our intention anyways. Like, let's work with them. So give them this contact information for us. Use this email address. It'll reach lots of people here. You'll get a response right away. In fact, send them more data. Send them these lists of domains we have. Send them information. Let's see. Let's work on this." And crickets, no response. And so tried again. Again, crickets, no response. Tried again. So about 3 times over a 5-day period, still getting no response. We had to kind of make the decision that, look, we've been working on this for a long time. This is information that really needs to get out there. Does raise a lot of questions that we as an industry should be asking. And so, so let's release the report now. And so there was a lot of these kind of interactions that did more than even just raise kind of our suspicion of Galcom's knowledge of what was going on here. But then there are other data points too, and that's what this graph here is starting to show. So this graph shows the number of registrations made per day through Galcom. And you see the big spike right there is a single day at the end of December, if I remember correctly, December 26th, it was somewhere around there, of 2019. So, about 6 months ago. In a single day, more registrations were made than almost the previous year combined, right? So think about this from a business perspective. If your business in a single day does more sales than it's done in almost the previous year combined, it's hard to imagine a scenario where you don't notice that, right? And again, it happens again and again, right? In these following two spikes. Not as large as that first one, for sure, but these very large spikes that are large anomalies, from anyone kind of looking, keeping track of business records and finances. Now, of course, we can say it's hard to imagine that Galcom doesn't know about this, but the other thing that's interesting is, what are the domains that are in these spikes? And what we found is that the domains in these spikes are the ones that are being used both, actually, with those scary types of extensions. In fact, we found them used quite heavily in conjunction with the scary extensions, as well as the other more subtle ones that we're kind of focused on, information collection, through the web store campaigns. So obviously these things are all tied. And at this point, we kind of had to go forward with this. All right. So that catches us up to about 1 week ago when we first released the report. What about now? Where are we at now? Actually, this is pretty cool. I actually intended to do live demos for this talk, and I couldn't because literally like thousands of these domains have changed at this point. So what you're seeing here on the left is the source code associated with one of them from a request during some of our earlier scans back in March. You see the date highlighted there, March 14th. So we see the redirection and the code that was ultimately returned to the client as part of one of these exploitative landing pages in there, where we see ActiveX objects being called, and the techniques they're using in this particular campaign group. And then what we see on the right is actually a request for the same domain made yesterday. And now what we're finding is that if these domains are redirecting, they really truly are redirecting to benign parking pages or more benign advertisements. I was seeing ultimately getting redirected in testing over the past couple of days to Amazon job listings and advertisements to go visit Myrtle Beach and things like that. So this is good. Like this is a good thing. In the course of a week, a massive kind of exploit surface area, to the tune of thousands of domains has literally changed over the course of a few nights. So this is awesome. One thing that's a little curious to us is also, though, in this time, not just the past week, actually, if we go back a little further to, the first, I think, really big sort of disclosure of what was going on here was when Google started taking down, all these dozens and dozens of extensions. If we use that as kind of an interesting milestone, I asked, well, what's changed since then? We actually see that 661 domains have quote unquote disappeared. And so what I mean by that is these domains are actively registered right now. So somebody owns them, but the IP resolution information for that domain has been pulled from DNS. So it's not reachable now. And in this list of 661, there's actually domains that have a lot of overlap with what we were seeing in our earlier like C2 lists and things like that. So there are some domains that we actually recognized as being interesting in certain ways in this list. But this list we made available. It'll be available. I think there'll be a link to it in the content that's released following this talk. There's actually a print version of this presentation, and we put the link in there so that all the researchers on the call can get that list and get all the data too. And here we see on the screen that there's also a pandabear.org for our good friends at CrowdStrike. Might want to see what panda bears taste like. All right, so what do we do about all of this? The good news is there's a lot of things that can be done now for close to free. And so one of the biggest things is look into, if you're not familiar with it already, look into group policy management of extensions. So there's a lot of options available there. In fact, while we're talking about policy, corporate policies should actually talk about extensions directly. We tend to talk about executables and applications and programs, call out extensions. They're the same thing. And so policy across the board, I think we can deal or address the extension threat in a variety of ways. There is also, Google makes a few different tools available to manage these as well, the admin console or Chrome browser cloud management. If you're not familiar with those, look into those and see if those can work within your stack there. And finally, hunt. Go hunt for these things. Like, go look for them. This is really, really important, and hunt, it's a variety of ways this word is used these days. Maybe audit is another way of calling it. Doesn't sound as good as hunt, but whatever you call it, go find this activity, because there are multiple reasons why I think these types of extensions have become so unbelievably prevalent so fast. And one is that kind of that pup label that gets associated with these and tools associated with these. But the other is EDR has totally transformed the way a SOC works, right? Before EDR, really SOCs just had network data. If we go back about 10 years, like they pretty much operated off network data. There was antivirus in all these enterprises, but a lot of times antivirus fell under desktop management teams or even desktop support teams. Like the SOC wasn't really utilizing that data. And so EDR created a whole new category of telemetry and brought that data into the SOC. But especially as it relates to browser extensions are a really hard problem for EDR, right? Because when, if you're looking at processes and you're looking at process behavior, what you're ultimately seeing is the browser doing things that browsers do that are allowed to do. It's just in this particular context and where the data is going that is really off. And so great, actually the network becomes a really powerful place to find that type of activity. And so we have an example here, just a couple examples of the types of things to go looking for. On the, in this little screenshot here, we have a web request that's been dissected, a post, to config to this particular domain. And in the headers, if you're not familiar with this already, in the headers, you will see the Chrome extension tag and the actual ID of the Chrome extension. And so a really good practice to get into is take that, go search Google for it. You can actually take even, this shows an example of just searching for the whole string without quotes. Really good to take just the ID by itself and put quotes around that too. But here, same result nonetheless. We search Google and Google doesn't know about this extension by ID. Now, if this extension has been in the store or is in the store, you will get results that point you to that extension in the store. So you can go examine it there. If you get no results, that means that extension is not in the store. Either has never been or was pulled out a long time ago or no one's come across it, but very suspicious to come across traffic in an enterprise environment that you can't explain, has some internal tool, and the internet doesn't know about it. We have some models in Awake that basically automate this. It looks for all these artifacts in the traffic. We'll go out and validate whether they are registered or unregistered extensions. And here we get a little example of, we also see activity that's going to a destination that is from an unregistered extension and a suspicious, probably potentially uncommon destination here. Okay, so that's one technique you can do. Another is look for, and we kind of started hitting on this actually in an example earlier, look for extensions that are coming from sources other than Google. And first of all, if it's coming from Google, it's going to be in TLS, right? And so there's different techniques, different ways of addressing that analysis, but keep things simple here. We'll look at the HTTP examples. So look for the extension, file extension, CRX is just a really simple way of doing this, coming from basically any place. Here we get the example from CloudFront. When you do that, chances are extremely high that what you find will not be good. Okay, so to me, I think some of the big sort of high-level takeaways from what is ultimately presented in the report. There's a bunch of detail all throughout, but when we kind of step back and summarize, I think the big questions that emerge from what we're seeing in there. One is to be sensitive to, I think the industry has struggled with this kind of ivory tower paradox, right? Which is you have all these, technology companies out there creating security products, creating security solutions. A really important group of people in a lot of these companies are the research team, but a lot of times they do their research, in the lab, and the lab is not the real world. And so by doing so, it's very easy to get stuck, especially over the past 10 years as we've moved so much of our technology and analysis to the cloud. It's easy to get stuck in that paradigm where something like this, like doing all the analysis and making decisions in the cloud, which is not the, it's not in the trenches, it's not the quote unquote real world, can create a pretty massive blind spot. And think that, we see this in the data in this report. We're not talking about one or two or a few hundred domains that some reputation engines happen to miss. We're talking about many thousands that across the board were pretty much largely, largely almost intentionally ignored because, as we come from the cloud, you get the redirections, and you don't get to see, you don't get to do deeper analysis. So that's something to be sensitive to, right? For the IR folks on the call and the researchers on the call, consider moving your operations more in-house as well, and then looking for differences. Here's, I think another issue we kind of talked about, but just to reiterate, right? SOCs, like I said, they've been transformed by EDR endpoint telemetry. It used to be, to get that telemetry, you had to deploy a forensics agent, and the kind of level of requirements or threshold to get those deployed was always extremely high. This is great. We just have it now. But as time has gone on, and I think more recently, we're having more time to learn what types of threats are better detected on the hosts or better detected on the network. But now it's been long enough that the attackers are having time to respond to the types of threats that we have become efficient at detecting in this data. So a reminder to really hone the network skills as well, and make sure to focus on the network. And finally, just something for all of us to be sensitive to. I do think that this was a great example of Google stepping up, not just in terms of highlighting their policy and process updates that they've made this year, but seeing, proof is in pudding. They came out and they delivered in this case. But like we were talking about earlier, for most enterprises, most of your business applications probably run in the browser. And so, we do need to think from a defender's perspective, what happens when the browser is the weakest link? And I think for a lot of organizations, this is a question they're only starting to ask. Great that it is starting to be asked, but I think it's something that we need to be more conscious about and talking about more broadly as an industry. And so we made it. We got a little bit of time left for some questions here. I saw some updates here. I wasn't looking at questions as they were coming in, but do we have any questions I could start with?
Yeah, thank you for that great presentation. We do have some questions ready for the Q&A. However, if anyone has a question for our presenter, please enter it into the Q&A window now. First question is, how about if the traffic is encrypted? How important was it to have L7 visibility?
Nice. Okay, that's right. So I guess a lot of the examples in the slide deck, and I'm trying to think on the report, I think a lot of the examples in the report too were focused on plain text traffic. And I think that makes it a lot easier to kind of highlight what's happening here and these threats and get a good idea of broadly across such a massive data set what's going on. But yes, absolutely. So quite a few of the threats we encountered were only TLS traffic, and so trying to keep this pretty agnostic, product agnostic. But I think when we get into talking about TLS-based threat detection, that there still is a lot of difference between the way different technologies approach that. For us, we have a variety of techniques that we actually use to do TLS application identification. We have some talks now that are approaching a couple years old on this subject. One is actually with SANS, so definitely look that one up. But to identify when, like, say, a browser has a rogue plugin on it, the way that those models identify that automatically is, first by looking for browser traffic, but then looking for signs of persistence, and looking for that signs of persistence to destinations that are relatively, they don't need to be totally unique, but relatively uncommon. Also, I kind of highlighted how for us, we have some logic section called Ava, the Awake Virtual Assistant, which will do investigative support for you based on artifacts. So we saw an example of using the Chrome extension ID. Similar type analysis is done with domains. So if you have traffic going to some particular domain, Ava has quite a few tricks up her sleeve in terms of being able to figure out if that domain is legitimate or suspicious or malicious. And so long story short is, no, in fact, because of what I was just describing, especially in the non-browser examples, a lot of times we detect compromises, we detect malware because TLS is being used. In fact, this actually does apply to this. In those when we found the custom rolled versions of Chromium that that weren't being used elsewhere in the enterprise, that ended up generating very unique TLS fingerprints associated with traffic to other domains, and so we were able to zero in on that way as well. But long story short is there are a variety of ways for dealing with TLS based threats. It is I think unfortunately at this point in time it is very product specific though.
Okay, great, thank you. Next question is, you recommended hunting for this behavior and not ignoring it, but how do I hunt for it?
I guess there could be some depth to that too. First of all, full packet capture. I mean, look, hunting. Let's kind of define what we mean by hunting, right? So hunting is, sometimes people refer to it as proactive investigation instead of waiting for a notification that you have a compromise. It's doing an investigation, just assuming that there's one in there, and then seeing what comes of that effort. Hunting, and to me, as I'm thinking about this, right, I also tend to, a lot of times people tend to think of hunting and not like alert analysis and investigation as very different things. But I'd throw out that actually, I don't think that they are. I think they are intimately linked, that hunting and alert investigation are kind of the same thing, except that in alert investigation, you have a starting point. You have an alert, or you have some external notification or tap on the shoulder or whatever it may be. And in the hunting case, you don't. You're just working to generate that initial starting point. But if you find something that's quote unquote interesting, then the workflow ends up being the same, right? But to generate that, so a lot of times when you have an alert that's generated, you think about the products that are generating those alerts. They have a bunch of raw data. They crunch it down, however, through whatever techniques they're going to use, and then they generate the alert and save the relevant data and discard the rest. So to do that initial alert generation, you need the raw data, right? You need it all. So that's why I say, if we're talking about the network, full packet capture, unquestionably. I mean, hunting didn't really exist on the endpoint, except for, I think a few kind of really sort of high profile outlets like Mandiant, who had their own technologies to broadly deploy a tool that basically had full forensic capability, because that's what's required to hunt. You need the full telemetry, all the data. So same applies to the network. Starting point is full packet capture, and then where you go from there depends on a variety of factors. For us, again, I'm trying to be agnostic here. I'll throw out an open source tool in a second, but for us, right, it's not just about, hey, here's a platform that's available for hunting on. Ultimately, you look at technologies like this because you want automated detection, and you need automated detection. For this, there's too much data for us to rely on people to always handle. And so, for us, that detection is actually, a lot of it's based on data science and other techniques, but a lot of it is based on models that are really embody what a hunter has done in the past successfully to find particular types of bad activity, and we save it in in a series of steps. So it's almost like, you can almost think of a lot of our models like SOAR in a way over forensic data. Okay, so ultimately, I think to hunt, right, you need to, and the reason I say all this is, what we're getting at here is you need to be able to get to the values. You need to be able to get to the raw data, where you get this information about like the browser extensions that may be there, or being able to see the data that's being sent out, so you can assess, not just get some flow data that says, hey, there was this tiny upload from the client to this server, but you can go look at, which, I mean, this happens frequently, especially for software that kind of runs in the background and does updates. Updaters do this a lot. But the ability to get in and look at the data and go, yes, wait a minute, I see URLs, I see history being sent out, I see URLs that show my internal application structure. And in fact, we've had some other enterprises turn around based on the hunts we've done and based on the things we've identified. They've come back and said, wow, we've been targeted with some spear phishing campaigns where they had really intimate knowledge of our internal application structures. And we've been struggling to figure out, if there isn't an insider telling them these paths and these structures, like, we have no idea how they've been figuring this out. And then, through these hunting exercises and looking at extensions a lot, where we see they're harvesting history and cookies and things like that and sending those out, there it is. There we see that the information being sent out to these, these totally unattributable sources or destinations, actually. So kind of a windy road there through the answer. I promise an open source. If you're not familiar already, Moloch, is an open source full packet capture system. Totally fair place to start. There are other technologies out there that do full packet capture. The thing that kind of separates them all is the levels of analytics that ride on top of that. Which in turn dictate, how much of the work with that tool is going to be manual versus, totally automated or even totally automated.
Okay, great. Thank you. And this is more of a comment before we go into the next question. A lot of audience members were coming. We did see a lot of similar questions that were coming in, wanting the list of the extensions and domains and etc. And to view that, you can actually scroll in through the chat window where we have posted those links for you to view. As we're going on with this next question, are SIEMs up to date with these kind of threats?
Yeah, okay, so I'm him and Han on this one because just internally this morning, we were having a discussion amongst our own team about this. So we haven't seen a lot of updates across the reputation databases yet. I mean, we just published, we just published all the IOCs like less than a week ago, and so I think the information is still kind of trickling out there. And we're slowly starting to work with more and more researchers on this too. So using those as a barometer, not so much. The thing about SIEMs is they need they take they ultimately, right, they take a lot of data and make it a lot less data. They correlate and put together, and I'm totally oversimplifying here. They do some incredible analysis. But they do analysis on the data they have. And so ultimately what that means in most cases is they need the alerts. And what we've found, and I kind of alluded to even in some of the screenshots here, is that most of this activity that we encountered over the past year didn't generate alerts. In fact, I would say basically all of it, because a lot of times that's what you're using network, NDR, network detection and response. That is your safety net. That's the last line. Right? When the SIEMs miss it, when the firewalls miss it, when all the controls miss it, when the endpoint clients miss it, the one last place where you can see it and not only investigate it, fully, but actually see it happening is on the network. And so that's why we use those. And so if we're seeing it, that means everything else failed, right? And so that's kind of what we see across the board here. So those detections, here we are, slightly, just barely less than a week later. SIMs haven't caught up to that yet, but I expect that should change over time. But that's where we're at today.